friends, hello there. Much love to you wherever you may be watching or listening to this from. We are in a series on Jesus and his explosive parables. And in this episode, we are jumping into the parable of the Good Samaritan. And over the next several episodes, we're going to be looking at this. In fact, we're not even going to get into the story at all today. And the reason is that most of Jesus's parables come out of some kind of an event. So something happens and then Jesus tells a story. So we're going to look at that event that transpired in order for Jesus to then talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, one of the things that I want to continually remind you of, but I actually don't do it very continually, is that we are reading the text in context and we are using this graphic to guide how we glean new understandings from the text. And so this is from my ebook, The Number One Mistake Most Everyone Makes Reading the Bible. It's a second edition. If you do not have this, it means you're not signed up at Walking the Text. Do that. We'll send it to you completely free, and then you'll also have access to this graphic. And I show you this because I not only want to remind you, but in the episode we're going to look at today, we're going to be in the linguistic and in the literary. So language and in the overall design of the book of Luke, because this story only occurs in the book of Luke. And so this is in Luke 10, verse 25. Things get kicked off, and so here we go. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" All right, a few quick observations. First, expert in the law. Who is this cat? Okay, in Greek, it's the word nomikos, which is a really fun word to say. It is a lawyer, an expert in the interpretation of Mosaic law or Israelite law. So all of the instructions God has given to the people, the additional instructions that they've kind of organized, this guy understands them all. He knows how to apply them. He is wicked smart. He is most likely a Pharisee, and typically these are very well-respected people in Jewish society, but not in the book of Luke. This is like new learnings for me. One of the things that you find is that every single time an expert in the law is in Luke, it is in a negative context. So in Luke chapter 7, we see in verses 29 to 30 that Luke gives us this parenthetical paragraph after one of Jesus' teachings, and he writes, "All the people, even the tax collectors, when they heard Jesus' words, acknowledged that God's way was right, because they had been baptized by John. But the Pharisees and the experts in the law rejected God's purpose for themselves because they had not been baptized by John." So in Luke here, experts in the law are in the negative 5 times. And here are all of those references. So if you're listening to the podcast and you want to see these, jump on the video later on. And so this is what we have, who's dialoguing with Jesus. Now we are told that he stood up. Now this is fascinating because anytime you stand up, it's actually a sign of respect. In Poet and Peasant, and then the combined edition Through Peasant Eyes, and specifically in Through Peasant Eyes, Kenneth Bailey says this. He says, "In the Middle East, the student has always stood to address his teacher out of courtesy." So you have an expert in the law who is standing, and you go, okay, negative to positive, but now we're back to negative because it's to test Jesus. It's like the dude has an agenda. But for some of us, we may go, well, is that really negative? Because how else are you going to learn without testing and asking questions and all of that? True, except the word test here is the same word that is used of what Satan does to Jesus when he is testing him in the desert. So Amy Jill Levine, who is a brilliant New Testament scholar, wrote a fantastic book on the parables called Short Stories by Jesus, and I am leaning heavily on her research for this particular teaching. But here's what she says about this in her book. By testing Jesus, the lawyer takes the devil's role. For it was Satan who had tested Jesus in the wilderness. Jesus shuts the devil up by telling him, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." Same word that is used there is used here. And so we recognize that what's unfolding here is not positive. And it goes even one step further in how the expert addresses Jesus when he calls him teacher. Now again, without any of this context or understanding the literary design of Luke, you would go, well, teacher just seems to be a positive thing. But not in Luke. Every time somebody is addressed as teacher, and it's typically Jesus, it's not a positive facet to the book. Let me show you one example also from Luke chapter 7. Verse 39, it says, when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. And then Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. So here this guy thinks Jesus is completely clueless, doesn't have an idea of what's going on. And in the midst of that, he's like, okay, teacher, go ahead and expound on this. And so here in Luke, teacher in the negative actually occurs 10 times. And here are all of those references right there. So we have this expert in the law who stood up to test Jesus, says teacher, and then the question he has is, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And we're going to come back to that question in a bit, but Jesus responds with, well, what is written in the law? How do you read it? Which, by the way, could be its own episode, because Jesus is saying it's not only what's there, it's how you understand it, it's how you're interpreting it. Friends, every religious debate about the Bible today, or almost all of them, isn't about what is written, it's about how people are interpreting what is written. And Jesus is trying to go, okay, dude, something's going on here. And in good rabbinical fashion, Jesus responds to the questions with his own set of questions in order to get a better understanding of where the lawyer is going with this conversation. Well, the lawyer then responds to Jesus' questions with, well, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and you love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that should sound really familiar to many of us. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is asked by an expert in the law, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus responds the same way. In fact, it is in the teaching series episode 15, entitled Loving God by Loving Others, that I break this down in its cultural and contextual pieces. And there's so many fascinating things that are going on there. But just for a synthesized understanding of what's happening right here, when you have the reference to the love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, this is from Deuteronomy 6:5. And you love your neighbor as yourself, this is from Leviticus 19:18. And what Jesus has done in Matthew 22 is that he lumps them together as one single commandment, if you will, and then says, and all of the Torah and the prophets hang on these two commandments. But when you see how it's working out and how Jesus pulls in this thing called Gezer HaShavah, you realize that it is basically saying that how you love God is reflected in how you love your neighbor. Now, friends, this is why the expert will go on and say, well, then who is my neighbor based on what unfolds in the rest of this conversation? And that's going to be the foundation for what we're going to jump into with the next episode. But for now, recognize that he is given a very favorable answer. And we don't know if he's just quoting this because he knows Jesus has taught this and this is what Jesus would want to hear. Maybe this is something that he has heard someone else say. Maybe he actually believes it through and through. But when he responds this way, Jesus says, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. And you go, okay, well, apparently the conversation is over until you recognize, but he wanted to justify himself. And you go, well, why is he trying to justify himself? What is going on? Apparently, we just missed something in the exchange between Jesus and the lawyer. And the answer is, we did. So what did we miss? What's going on here? Well, when the lawyer asks the question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? This is a very Jewish way of talking about how you become a participant in the world to come. Typically in the Western world, we say eternal life. For the Jewish world, they talk about the world to come. Now, Jesus talks this way in the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. He says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Now, it feels a little bit paradoxically because inherit is something that is given to you. It's not something that you do to gain. But this language of inheriting the world to come was very typical in the first century world. In fact, let me show you one interesting reference from Rabbi Hillel, who was a contemporary with Jesus for about 15 years or so. And in the Mishnah, the Jewish text recorded in roughly 200 AD in Pirkei Avot, you have Rabbi Hillel who says, "Who has gained for himself words of Torah has gained for himself the life of the world to come." Now what he's saying here is that if you have embodied Torah, then you've embodied God's words, God's instructions, God's commands, and therefore you will be part of the world to come because you are doing what God is asking you to do. You are in relationship with God. And so this is, by the way, a really cool connection because when the expert responds, you love God and you love others, you love neighbor, and Jesus goes, yeah, like be doing that. Jesus has already said that loving God and loving neighbor, all of the commandments hang on these. So if you're doing that, you're in good shape, if you will. The problem, however, comes in the question that the lawyer or the expert in the law asks when Luke records for us the word do. Now, this is Amy Jill Levine again, helping us to understand from a linguistic perspective and from a tense, like what is the tense that the Greek is in here. She writes this. She says the verb is an aorist participle. Yep, I know. Went right over the head of almost all of you. All good. Here's what she then clarifies. A tense that suggests a single limited action. So he has said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What's one action or the only action, the limited action, the single action that I do in order to ensure that I am part of the world to come? And Jesus goes, okay, well, help me to understand what you're after. Like, what's written in the Torah? How do you read it? He responds, you love God, you love neighbor. And then Jesus goes, yes, you have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. Notice Jesus uses the phrase do this, but here's where it's different. It's not the same verb tense as the expert in the law. Amy Jill Levine, one more time, helps us to understand this. She says this about Jesus' use of the word do. She says the lawyer got the right answer, good for him. However, he did not quite get the right question. So Jesus changes it for him. Whereas the lawyer asked about eternal life, Jesus reframes what is at stake by exhorting, do this and you will live. The imperative do focuses not on a single action, but on an ongoing relationship. Oh, this is so brilliant and so cool. Jesus goes, do this and you will live. You've just said that you love God by loving others. And so Jesus goes, yes, this ongoing relationship, I want you to do this continuously and you will live. This is a present understanding. You will live the fullness of life right now. The lawyer, however, is saying, what's the single limited thing I do in order to get eternal life? And you go, oh, understanding now how the language is working, you go, this is a bad question. Right? It is a bad question to ask. Now, for many of us, I would imagine we're listening to this or we're watching this and we're going, okay, I can see how it's a bit shady, but why are you like exclamation point, it's a bad question? Well, let me give you an illustration that I think may help you to understand what's going on here. When I was in high school, we had a police officer who came in one afternoon and gave about a 15-minute talk to the class that I was in about what it was like to be a police officer. And at the end of their talk, they said, hey, do any of you have any questions? And so people started asking questions pertaining to what the police officer had just talked about. I, however, had a question that had nothing to do with what the police officer was talking about, but only the police officer could answer. And so I was a little bit hesitant, but I finally got up the courage and I raised my hand and I said, yeah, here's my question. How much can I go over the speed limit before you feel like it's too much and you need to pull me over and give me a ticket? And the whole room went dead silent. And everybody's eyes looked on me, and then they looked on the officer, and the officer just stood there and kind of gave a little grin, crossed his arms and said, "The speed limit is there for a purpose. Abide by the speed limit." And everyone was just like, oh man, he just threw down on Brad. And I just wanted to like curl up in a corner under a blanket and suck my thumb. Now the question I asked is a question that you would have asked if you wouldn't have been embarrassed to ask it. All right, so you can't burn me at the stake. You want to know that as well. Is it 5 miles an hour? Is it 7 miles an hour? But friends, understand, it's a bad question. Why? Because how is the officer going to respond? You know, I typically think that 5 miles an hour over the speed limit is great. Maybe 7. You get beyond that, and now you're starting to push it. Except if you're in a 25, you should keep it under, 5, so maybe 3 to 5. No, they're not going to do that. He just gave a talk about how it's his role and responsibility to uphold the law, and now I've asked a question. I'm asking him to tell me how to break the law. Friends, it's a bad question, and it's a trick question, and it's exactly what's going on with the expert in the Torah. He recognizes that there's no single action, and yet he's probably asking Jesus to give a single action so he can debate the finer points of Torah. And Jesus goes like, you've got this thing all wrong. It's a bare minimum question that you are asking. And Jesus goes, it's much bigger than this. And friends, it's not just a bad question or a trick question, a bare minimum question. Friends, it's the wrong question to ask. And yet, I wonder how many of us are asking the same kinds of questions. We ask questions like, well, how much should I read my Bible or pray on a daily basis? How much should I tithe so that I'm, right with God? What do I need to do to ensure that I have eternal life? And then now that I feel solidified in that, I can kind of do things as I want to. I can kind of live life however I want to. Friends, those are bad questions. Those are the wrong questions. The better questions to ask around those areas would be, well, how much time do I need to be spending reading the Word and praying on a daily basis so that my heart is recalibrated back to what God desires, so that when I go forth for my day, I represent God well in the world and I live in such a way that God can work through me so that His kingdom can advance here on earth as it is in heaven. Right? How much should I be tithing to be reminded that my trust is in God and not in my financial resources? What do I need to give in order to recognize what it is to live a sacrificial lifestyle and to recognize that I want to be a person who is generous with what God has entrusted to me? Like, what are the habits that I need to be cultivating to live a vibrant life right now? Friends, those are the better questions, because it is not about the bare minimum. It's about who you're becoming. And for the expert in the law, he's asking about the bare minimum. And Jesus goes, no. This is about who you're becoming. Do this continuously, and you will live a vibrancy of life right now. For friends, for Jesus, eternal life is not something that happens after you die. Eternal life is a quality of life that is available to us right now that extends into eternity. I mean, in John 17, Jesus will say, "This is eternal life, Father, that they know me." And so, friends, we're going to get into, well, where does this go from here? And all of a sudden, the expert wants clarification on who the neighbor is. But for our purposes in this episode, may we be asking better questions. Because I think for many of us, we live by the bare minimum. And Jesus is more interested in who we're becoming. What are the better questions that we need to ask in order to live a more vibrant life right now. Because friends, if we're asking the bare minimum, we are missing what Jesus is calling us to be and do, and we are missing out on the fullness of life. But if we can walk the way that Jesus is calling us to walk, if we can do this continuously, then I believe we will live a fuller and more vibrant life right here, right now. So friends, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. And may you walk out this text well in your life.